Today we're going to be talking about research data management. My name is Andrew Creamer. I am the Scientific Data Management Specialist at Brown University Library. And I'm very eager to talk to you today about what data management is and why data management is important, and some emerging policies around data management that are emerging from institutions and at the federal level. And so we can begin with defining what is research data. And this OMB circular is sort of a standard definition for what research data is. And so if you want to contextualize research data management and think about data as the factual information necessary to validate results. So thinking about the data necessary to reproduce or replicate an experiment is a good place to start. The information here also covers things that are not considered research data, and things like trade secrets or protected health information. Obviously, this is information related to publications, preliminary analyses, or drafts, for example. When we talk about what is research data management, it's all of these activities that go into organizing research data and storing and backing up and versioning research data and making that available so that people can discover it and access it and use it and reuse it over the life cycle of its usefulness. And so this concept of the data life cycle we're going to talk about this morning. And this includes things like what happens before a project begins, and what happens during the project, and what happens to the data after the project has been completed, and how data can then be reused or repurposed by other investigators for further discovery. So why manage research data? This list is obviously longer than I can go on into this slide, but I think that these are some of the highlights here. One is it is a core of responsible conduct of research. So obviously we expect researchers to have a responsibility to manage their data so that data can be trusted, and the integrity of data is an important part of the research process. Data has value, so I think that there's been a movement over the last 10 years to see data as having an equivalent value at least to the published articles based on the research data, and that researchers should be able to get credit for the data that they produce, especially if other people reuse those data or cite those data sets in their own research. The responsibility, as I mentioned before, also not only extends from the federal government with the Office of Research Integrity, but also at the institutional level. Institutions expect their researchers and their student researchers to manage and retain data. In the case of an audit or inquiry or investigation, they want to be able to produce data, again, to validate results or answer any challenges that might be contested, for example. Federal funders, as I mentioned before, they want data to be disseminated and made publicly available to other people, other researchers and the public. And lastly, this is more ominous, is that data is at risk, that it is an asset that can easily be lost if it's not managed. And we know that because data has value, that there's a movement to make sure that data sticks around. And so things like earthquakes or fires or data loss is actually quite common. And that's something that we should be guarding against in the future here. So as I mentioned, responsible conduct of research before, this slide is just a snapshot of the current cases of scientific misconduct on the page of the Office of Research Integrity at the Department of Health and Human Services. And so we're in July now, so as you can see, 2016 hasn't been completed, but there's quite a few cases already. And of the 5 of the 6 cases that have already been closed, you can see that they have to do with fabricating data or falsifying data of a nature, one of another. So when I go back to why institutions care about organizing and making data available, should someone ever be accused of scientific misconduct, or there's a question about a research project, being able to produce the data to defend yourself is quite important. When I say data is at risk, this slide is from a recent publication Alberto Pepe, Alyssa Goodman, Merce Croces, Chris Erdman, they looked at papers in astrophysics that had been published that cited data. And over 10 years, you can see that in more than half those papers, the data cited can no longer be accessed. So that data is no longer able to be located to validate the results of those publications. And so the reader or the user then has to contact the corresponding author, and then the corresponding author may say, oh, we've lost that server went down, we don't have that anymore, or I think my co-author has that data set, it's in a box in her basement someplace, or oh, my postdoc has now went back to France. So there's a lot of reasons that we want to make data accessible, but there's even more reasons that we want to make data archived and preserved for access. When we talk about reproducibility, the idea that data can help you replicate or reproduce research results, the National Institutes of Health is very interested in promoting reproducibility and what I'm calling the recipe or ingredients for reproducibility, which include things like data, but data can be confusing because for some people it might be raw data underlying published results. It might be processed data or analyzed data. And it's really an appraisal process where the principal investigator and the team and the scientific community has to determine what data is necessary to replicate or reproduce research results. What data is necessary for the integrity of that experiment. And so when we say about data, it's not just the data itself, but also these other digital objects that are orbiting research data and published findings. Things like metadata and documentation, which are the contextual information and details necessary to understand that experiment or to understand results. And metadata, or the information about those data sets, will help people discover those data sets, they'll help people access those data sets, they'll help people use those data sets, and they'll help people reuse or repurpose those data sets. So documentation and metadata are fundamental. And we've heard from researchers in the past that when they've downloaded data sets from a data sharing repository that has not also had documentation and metadata uploaded with the data sets, that in many cases those data sets are useless to them. And then the third one, we talk about code and analysis scripts that are associated with the analyses and the results. And so if we combine all of these elements together, these are the data sets that are necessary for reproducibility. So it's not just the data, but also the metadata and also the analysis code that would be necessary to come up with the results or replicate those results. The life cycle of research data that I've mentioned in the definition, as I said before, talks about what happens before an experiment begins, happening during data collection, and then what happens to the data after the project has ended. And this data lifecycle image comes from data 1, and we're going to sort of step through some of these this morning. One, for example, plan. Before data collection begins, a lot of people say, well, what can I do before I start collecting data? And the truth is you can do a lot, actually, before you start collecting data in terms of managing research data, even if there's not data to actually actively be managed. And one of those is creating a standard way for files to be named so that team members can actually locate their own data. Even if it's a single researcher working alone, he or she may want to be able to come up with a standard way of naming files so that he or she can find the file that they're looking for. And so having file naming conventions standardized among team members helps people locate information. Creating a standard way for structuring your folder directory. So if you know where those files are located, that's also helpful among team members. So if you have a folder that's labeled by an experimental method, and within that folder you have another folder with the team member's name, and within that folder you have the files from that experiment. If that's sort of the logical system set up, people can easily find information when they need it. There are also community standards for naming and describing data elements. We talked about metadata before, and some scientific communities have gotten together to say, this is the important information necessary to describe this experiment, or this is the information necessary to describe data in our field. And these minimum information standards and reporting standards can also be a great way to sort of lay out the way your lab notebook or electronic lab notebook is set to collect this types of information. So you have submission details about experiments. You can also think about formats. So formats that the data will be collected in, and sometimes those formats will be proprietary. So you need to own that software or purchase that software before you can render those data. But there may be ways that you can export that data format into a more open or preservation-friendly format that others might be able to widely access. And so when you think about file formats from the very beginning, you can think about, well, how is the data going to be created? What's the optimal format for storage? And for some people, that might be a compressed format in which it saves space, and other people, it might be an uncompressed format because the raw data in itself, or the digital negative, for example, for an image, might have value. And then what is the optimal or standard among the scientific community for sharing data in that format? And the last one talks about choosing a repository. So you might say, well, doesn't that come at the end of the data lifecycle? But in reality, knowing where your data might end up, either if it's a repository associated with a publication or a publisher or a journal, or if it's a repository associated with your field or a repository associated with your institution, if you already have an idea of where your data will end up, it kind of helps you from the very beginning format and plan and organize your data for deposit in that. And that saves a lot of time because unfortunately, in my day-to-day job, I do run into a lot of people who are interested in depositing in a data sharing repository, and then they have to go back and they have to reconvert their data into different formats, or they have to go back and they have to put in the metadata and information necessary. And that's a lot of effort. Whereas if they had been doing that from the very beginning, had they been collecting those elements in their lab notebooks, had they been collecting that information in some sort of documentation along the way, and been converting those files along the way, and appraising the data that they're going to deposit along the way, it's going to save a lot of time, energy, and other resources. So this is just before a project begins. When we talk about the describe part of the cycle, if we skip down, I've talked about the contextual details for discovery, access, use, reuse, repurposing. All of this information, the metadata, can be included in the electronic lab notebook or paper lab notebook. It can be in a data dictionary that talks about the variables of columns of a spreadsheet, or what the parameters and the values of those cells are. It could be a README file that's associated with software that's created, and I've mentioned analysis and software code before. It could be a code book. If you're doing some sort of qualitative or quantitative analysis that would be associated with those data sets. Or if you're dealing with a reporting standard or a minimum information standard, making sure that all of that information is encoded in some way and have associated files deposited with the data sets themselves into a data sharing repository or shared with other researchers or the public. The preserve piece. When we talk about preserve, obviously preserve can mean many things. Long-term preservation, long-term can mean many things. But what funders are talking about is the preservation of access, that people will, even after the project ends, be able to access the data from this project into the future. And when we talk about archiving, obviously there are different types of repositories out there that you may choose to deposit your data. So some of these are disciplinary repositories. So you have repositories where a scientific community has gone together and said, we need a place to deposit the data in our field. And obviously there's a lot of climate databases surrounding climate science and change biology, and that makes sense that those repositories are there so that people can share information. But there's also repositories built around methods. And so there are certain imaging databases, for example. There are certain core facilities that have certain repositories built around them. So if it's sequencing or flow cytometry, there's a repository for those types of methods. There's also obviously the federally funded repositories that most people are familiar with, like the National Centers for Biotechnology Information, or NCBI, which funds a large amount of repositories for sequencing data, like the Sequence Read Archive, GEO, dbGaP, for example. But there's also NIH-funded repositories that are not NCBI, that people may not be aware of, things like the cancer imaging database. And then institutional repositories. Those are repositories that might be at a university or a college or a research center, many cases managed by the library, that can help to preserve and publish and disseminate information from that institution. And in many cases, it's not just publications, but also data. And then there are open repositories. And you can see, especially with publications from journals, that they might suggest a host of open repositories if you're at an institution that doesn't have an institutional repository, or there's not a disciplinary or federal repository for the type of work that you're doing or the type of data you're producing. And then I also want to mention, because some people might have sensitive data sets, that they might need special data centers or data enclaves in which the data is protected and people have to apply for access and have credentials for access, and there might be a data use agreement for how those data will be used, and they might have to be accessed under controlled conditions. So when we say about preserve, there's a whole host of ways that people can choose to preserve data access. And I've mentioned formats before, making sure that they're in an open or preservation-friendly format, choosing a repository that has an open license or public license so that people can download those data sets and reuse those data sets. The discover portion, when we talk about publishing and citing data, or how do people know where these data sets are? So one of those ways is getting a digital object identifier. So a lot of libraries and institutional repositories have been assigning or minting DOIs for data sets, which allow people to have a data citation that people can follow to find those data sets. So if you remember back to the earlier slide, Alberto Pepe's and his colleagues' article about after 10 years, data were no longer to be located associated with these articles, that these persistent identifiers will help people locate those data sets. And if you look at other types of IDs, things like accession numbers, if you're in the sequence read archive, for example, you would get an accession number from NCBI. If you're doing, have a data set related to a clinical trial, you'll have an NCT number. All of these IDs and persistent identifiers can help people locate data after a project ends and helps people provide attribution for the people who have created those data sets. And so the purpose of having a data citation is that when you write your manuscript in your publication, that those data citations will say where those identifiers are, where those data sets are located, and how people can access them. If there's a terms of use, for example, a license, a Creative Commons license, an open data license, a GNU license, or an MIT software license, there's a whole host of licenses associated with data sets that people can use to assign terms of use. And then at the very bottom, of course, is making sure that people understand that they may not be able to get access to certain data sets for privacy, ethics, confidentiality, intellectual property reasons, and trying to figure out ways that they can get access is something that you'd have to talk to your IRB about or your technology transfer office about for sensitive data sets. So this is an example from a researcher at my institution who has cited data in a publication. So you see here at the bottom it says data availability. The authors confirm that all data underlying the findings are fully available without restriction. Data are available from the Brown University Digital Repository. There's a stable URL, and then using the DOI below. And so this sort of links back. So the reader accesses the article, reads their article and says, oh, I'm really interested in this project. I'd like to learn more about the data or the experiments conducted. Or, I'm doing work in the same area. I'd like to use this data in my own experiments. And it's easy to be located in the manuscript. When we talk about data policies, they're coming from different angles. So one of them might be coming from the institution itself. So institutions are interested in who owns data. So there's policies at the institutional level about data ownership and intellectual property. So when people create data, who actually is the owner of that data, right? And in many cases, it might be the institution if we're talking about federally funded research. And the principal investigator might be seen as the steward of that data. And then both the steward and the owner have certain rights when it comes to ownership or if that data would be related to intellectual property in some way, that might be negotiated at the institutional level. And those policies usually delineate that process. So who is the owner of data, who is the steward of data, and what is the process for filing an application to protect intellectual property. The data management policies and stewardship responsibilities, those go back to the responsible conduct of research that I mentioned at the beginning, where the institution says to the investigator and to students that they have a responsibility to be stewards of data and to be able to take care of the data as an asset owned by the university or institution. And then there are public access policies, many coming from the federal level, which talk about how data should be shared with other researchers or disseminated to other researchers or the public. And then there's retention policies. So retention policies say, how long should I keep data? I'm doing data on this project, or I'm collecting data under this project. How long should I keep the data around? And retention itself, just like data policies that you have the institutional level, you might have a state policy, you might have a federal level, a funder level. Retention is the same way. So there might be local retention requirements. So your institution might say, you know, keep data for 3 years or 5 years or 6 years or 7 years. Your institutional review board might have policies for how long data needs to be retained. Depending on the type of research you're doing, if you're doing human subjects research, they are a clinical trial or an FDA trial. They have requirements for how long data should be retained. Where you're getting your grant money from, the funder has an idea of how long data needs to be retained. And ultimately, the publishers also have requirements for how long data should be retained. And many people are familiar with their institutional requirements or the requirements by law, but few are actually familiar with how long their publisher requires them to keep a data set retained. And people have had articles retracted, unfortunately, because people have requested a data set and the author has not been able to produce a data set during that required or mandated period for data retention. And that goes again back to the idea of being able to produce data if there's an investigation or an audit. During that period of retention, you should be able to produce those assets. Even if an investigator leaves the university and goes to another university, the university is still responsible for being able to produce that data during that period. So this is a great website here. This is from Johns Hopkins University and Spark, and they sort of partnered together to look at the federal public access policies that have been emerging. The Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House had called upon federal agencies, federal funding agencies with assets of $100 million or more to come up with plans to make their publications and data available. And so the idea being research is publicly funded, so it should be available to the public so that they should have access to not only the publication but the underlying data itself. And I think as of April this year, 16 federal funders have come up with their public access plans. And so this particular website allows you to go in and look for the funder that you're interested in, and you can see what their public access policy is concerning data sets or publications. And obviously this will be added to as more public access policies are written. So this is an example of the genomic data sharing, the GDS from the National Institutes of Health. So this is a researcher at my institution who published an article in genomics, and at the bottom here in the methodology you can see that they cite where their sequence files are at the National Center for Biotechnology or Information, or NCBI. And you can see here it says all files have been submitted to the GenBank Sequence Read Archive for public access. You can see both the accession number that I mentioned before and then the DOI. And so those identifiers will help people to cite that data and locate that data and provide attribution to the data creators. When we talk about retention here, so I've mentioned before that articles might have been retracted because they haven't, the investigators or the authors haven't retained data for the amount of time that they should have done. And this was just a recent example where a paper I think that came out in 2011, less than 2 years later, somebody questioned the data in the paper and they contacted the corresponding author, and the corresponding author said, "I'm sorry, we can't find this data anymore." And so it's not even after 10 years. It's even within a shorter time span than that. And you can see here it says the primary data could not be located to verify corrections made from secondary tables. Accordingly, we have no way of confirming the correct data and with regret wish to retract the article. So this is a sort of a worst case scenario, but a lesson for all of us of why research data management is important and why data retention is important. And so if we just look at a sample of some some federal scientific research funders who are requiring a data management or data sharing plan, not only the NIH, but the NSF and the DOE, NASA, Department of Defense, the Geological Survey, Department of Transportation, FDA, CDC, Agency of Healthcare Research and Quality, NOAA. So this is something that's going to affect more people. So if you haven't had to write a data management plan or a data sharing plan for a grant proposal, in the coming year ahead, you might have to for the first time. So what are some common features of a data management plan? So if you look across these data management plans and data sharing plans, there's a description of the data being produced in the formats, and we talked before about why formats are important, especially for storage and access and preservation. A description and metadata plans for the project, so how data will be made discoverable and accessible and usable by providing the contextual details necessary for understanding that project. Being able to lay out how data will be stored or secured if they're sensitive data, how data will be versioned and backed up, and the cyber infrastructure necessary for conducting that project, which could be things like budget, personnel, resources in some cases. The policies for access, so who gets access to data, when do they get access for data, how do they get access for data, if there are restrictions to the data set, for example, because of ethics and privacy and confidentiality or intellectual property or national security. Policies for dissemination and reuse, so the terms of use or those licenses I mentioned before. How are data users supposed to use data sets? Do they provide attribution? Are they allowed to redistribute those data sets? Are they allowed to make derivatives with those data products? And then the last one of what happens after the project. When I said preserve access, the post-project archiving and preservation by depositing into a data sharing repository. So what are the plans for depositing into a repository and how will people get access to that repository? So if you are interested in learning more about what research data management is or the basics of research data management, my colleague Carly Strasser has a great primer on research data management that she did with NISO, the National Information Standards Organization. Data One, which I've mentioned before, they have a data management best practices database, which is very useful. And at the bottom, my colleague Christian Briney at the University of Wisconsin has just published a great book, Data Management for Researchers, Organize, Maintain, and Share Your Data for Research Success. Thank you very much.